Well, first off, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to come and listen to me talk at you for a bit. I'm Alasdair Mac Roibeirt. I live in the barony of Glimmer within the Kingdom of Antir, for any of you who are tuning in from out of this kingdom. And this focus of this class is going to be on the six board box as a stepping stone to further projects. I've been doing woodworking for quite a few years now. I've done a variety of things, and usually the things that I hear a lot of people saying is, "Oh, that I could never do that. I wouldn't even know where to begin." And you hear that with a lot of arts that people do in the SCA or crafts in general. And kind of the whole idea here is to show people that yeah, you can. And the other thing is well, I'm just new to woodworking. What tools do I need to buy? What should I buy all this stuff? But oh, it's so expensive. And by focusing on project driven tool needs, it kind of cuts that expense down a bit and lets you build your toolkit, and you don't end up with a great big pile of stuff going, well, what do I do with this now? Or I never actually needed that. So we're going to kind of work our way through a variety of projects, hopefully over a couple of different classes. So, excuse me, this one is the six board box. And we're going to start there as it's kind of a basic, it's a staple, and it's something that a lot of people can do pretty easily. A lot of you may actually have the tools you need on hand in your house. First question, of course, is what is this six board box? This is an example of a six board box. In theory, all boxes are technically a six board ish, depending on their construction. But you're looking at two front and back, side to side, top and bottom, so you get six boards. In this case, six board is usually specifically referring to is single pieces of wood. There are no inset panels. There are no glue ups, although you can. And it's just a real simple box. I mean, there's the inside, nothing special, nothing fancy. The nice thing about the six board box is it is very simple, and a lot of cultures have them, and you can make them very specific to your particular time and place with small details. Cutting a different foot design, putting it at a different angle, perhaps different proportions. So it's something that can be customized to your particular needs pretty easy. If you're using it for a feast gear box, it needs to be a little wider to accommodate a plate. If you're using it for garb, it can be a little smaller. Handles or not, really a lot of stuff that's kind of up to you. Um, so the biggest thing that you're going to need for this particular class is a saw of some form. And there are many different options, many different varieties you can go through. So we're going to go through a few of them. You can kind of see some of the ones here, starting with hand saws. There are a lot of different types of saws out there. There are a couple of different major classifications of saw. You've got usually a rip saw or a crosscut saw. Just starting out, most people are going to end up going to one of the big box stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace Hardware, whatever you have, and you're going to probably end up buying what they've got, and they've usually got one or two saws there. So it's kind of hard to find something specialized. That'll usually come later. You've done a little more research, you're getting a little bit more serious about what you're doing on. It really doesn't matter a lot for a small project like this. It makes it easier. And if you get into different types of woods, different sets to your teeth, all kinds of stuff, there's a whole nother class we're not even going to get into. So this is your just basic panel saw. I'm sure you've all seen these somewhere. They're used for all kinds of stuff. They cut a straight line in theory, and they're pretty simple. You put it on the wood, you let the weight of the saw do the work, you go to town. There are other styles of saw. Uh, this is a dovetail saw. Again, it's just a straight panel with teeth. Not quite set for doing what we're going to do here, but if that's what you got, you can use it. Some other types of saws here, a gent saw, basically the same thing as a dovetail saw, the difference being the handle is straight off the end, whereas a dovetail saw, it's more of a pistol grip. The Japanese style saws, which are thinner blades than most of the Western style, and they're designed to be cut on the pull as opposed to the push. Also usable. Specialty saws like a coping saw. You can use those. They're not going to be the best saw you can use for this. They are good for curves, they're good for small angles and intricate cuts, but they're not really made to do long straight cuts, and you'll be at a disadvantage in this kind of a project with that. For detail work, for cutting out feet, for cutting ornamentations, they're great. Then we move on into power saws. So this is a circular saw. This is specifically, it's a left hand feed model. So the blade is actually on the right. It's a really weird way they classify it. I've never quite understood. I liked it being right-handed because it means I can cut with it in my right hand and follow my line as I'm going. Um, Pretty simple saw. This one's usually, it's a 7¼ inch blade, so you can usually get roughly 2.5, maybe 3 inches of cutting, depending. The base on it is adjustable, so it goes up or down. It controls the depth of your cut. There's also a lever on the front, so you can control if you're doing angle cuts. It's pretty versatile. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but it's a good basic saw, and a lot of people pick them up cheap and they have them around the house for doing whatever household projects. From there, you move on to a jigsaw or a saber saw, depending on where you got it, you call it, where you are, what it's called. It's a single blade. It's a fairly small blade. You can get longer blades to go in and out. It's good for, you can do straight curves, or cuts, you can do some curves. You can get a variety of blades to do different kind of materials. The big problem with it is this blade is free floating. And if you can see that, it can bend. A little hard to see in that detail. So when you're cutting through lumber, as you're going through, you pushing too much or you're leaning too much, you can actually get, instead of that cut coming in nice and straight, it can be at an angle, or it can curve and be wavy and all. So it's not a bad saw to have. You can make it work. I have done these boxes with them before, but it's really, what do you have? This is a scroll saw. This is the mechanical version of a coping saw. It is not really suited for most furniture constructions. You could do the box with it, not a problem, as long as it'll fit under the arm here. You can see that the wood. I apologize for the lighting. It's not really designed for camera. It is designed for me to be able to see clearly. But this is a saw blade. It goes up and down. It's fixed top to bottom. It'll be a little bit straighter of a cut than a jigsaw, but not a great deal. It's more for doing really detailed fine stuff. But again, if it's got what you got access to, use it. Then we get into the big stationary power tools. I'm not going to try and show you my table saw. Currently, this camera is sitting on it, but I think most people are pretty familiar with what a table saw is. It excels at cutting straight lines accurately and repetitively, so you can get repeatable details and tight fits. Behind me to the side is a bandsaw. So called because it's got a blade on here and a couple of wheels, and it just makes a big loop. It does give a very steady cut compared to the jigsaw, but it also can suffer from a bit of blade deformation. So you're going to get some kind of wiggling back and forth sometimes, especially if you force it. One of the big things with any saw, power saw or hand saw, is don't force your cut. Let the weight of the saw, if it's a hand saw, do the cutting for you. You're providing the motion. If your hand is getting tired, you're probably gripping too tight and you're pushing too hard. Let the saw do the work. That's what it's there for. And it shouldn't tire you out to do the woodworking. So any of these will do the job. You can make quite a bit of stuff with it. And depending on what you're doing, some of them are more essential than others for various details and features of what you're doing. For what we're doing here, you want a straight cut. You want a fairly straight line. A jigsaw will work great. Circular saw will work great. Hand saw will work great. Any of those. If you don't have a saw and you are planning on going out, I'm going to make one of these, what saw should I get? I would say it's really a toss-up between buying yourself a circular saw or a jigsaw. They're going to give you the most flexibility for future projects and the most capacity to do different things. If you've got the money, you can buy smaller. This is a 14-inch bandsaw here. It's kind of the crossover point between strictly hobby and starting to get into professional use as far as the capacity for it. And when they call it a 14-inch bandsaw, they're referring to the size of the wheel inside here that the blade travels around. So You can get smaller ones. There are 9 inches. There are various smaller ones. This is mounted on a base. It's totally separate. You can get smaller ones that'll sit on your bench top, so you can put them in a cabinet when you're not using it. Also a good choice, but really it's a question of what you have time for, what you have room for, and what your budget is. So right off the top, I would say circular saw or jigsaw are probably your best bets if you're buying. So again, 6-board box. We've already gone over that. This is a 6-board box. This one is built out of pine, if you want to get technical about it, and long-winded, it is called blue stain beetle-killed ponderosa pine. I don't know how well the color comes across it. It's called that because of the stain left behind by the beetles that were boring through it, and that's where all these holes came from. It's pretty. There's enough of it there to be structurally nice. It's usable. I made a couple of them for Mr. Steese's elevation, actually, and they've served us pretty well. They're loosely based on the dimensions and proportions of a Mastermere style box, obviously without all of the angles to it. They were just knocked together to be done pretty quickly. As you can see here, this one, the lid is secured by battens on the bottom, so it keeps the lid from falling off. But I haven't worried about hinges or doing anything fancy. This is quick, easy knock together. If you look really closely, if I can find it, right here, that dot, those are actually pegs that are holding the pieces on there. I glue and peg when I do it because I believe in redundancy and over-engineering whenever possible. The size of this box is dictated on the size of the lumber that I had available. If you are new to woodworking, you're pretty much going to be limited by what you can find in your local stores. A lot of times that's a Lowe's or Home Depot or Ace, whatever lumber yard you have near you. If you're interested in looking for more stuff, if you actually check my blog, Sawdust and Shavings at home.blog, I have a handout in there that I did on looking for lumber. But we're going to go with your basic, easy to find material that just about anybody should be able to access. So the basis for this class is right here. And this is a 12-inch wide, 1-inch thick, 8-foot long pine, common pine board from Home Depot. They run about $20 right now in my area, so it's a pretty economical board to get. And it's not difficult to get home, even if you got a smaller car. Most people can fit this in the car. The downside to it is it's only 12 inches wide, nominally. So if you actually check the measurement on these, they're not fully 12 inches. Usually when you go to the lumber yards or go to the stores and you buy lumber, it is the size that they list is a pre-finished size. So this one is sold as a 1x12 by 8. And when I measure it, it's actually 3/4 of an inch thick by 11 1/4 inches wide by 8 foot 3/8 inches. So it's not fully any of the dimensions it's supposed to be, except for the length where you get a little extra, which is nice to take care of the saw curve. So that is going to dictate the size of my box. Since it's a 6-board box, I need to divide this board down into 6 even pieces. You can either do it going through mathematically and figure I'm going to divide it by numbers. You can go through and you can divide it up by splitting the length and splitting the length. Easiest way to do it, tape measure. So in this particular case, it is, like I said, it is 8 foot. It is 96 inches. So that works really nicely for what we're doing here because we can divide it down into 16-inch long sections. And for those who are not really conversant with a tape measure, if you look just like this one, most tape measures have different colored marks on it. Right there is 16 inches. It's common stud layout for commercial industry, which means that when you're laying out your board, every 16 inches, there's going to be a different colored number on there. 16, 32, 48. So it plays beautifully into this project, almost like they were designed for each other. because to lay out your marks, you're just going through and doing it by those numbers. So once you've laid out your board, in this case, I've got it laid out into 6 pieces. You can't really see it particularly well here. No, I don't think I can get the line to show. Lighting being what it is. Once I've designed it, I've laid it out, one of the things to keep in mind is kerf. And kerf is a term for the amount of material taken out by your saw blade. When you're buying various blades, you will find some are labeled as thin kerf blades. They're thinner. There's a variety of different things, but keeping in mind you're going to lose some material. So when you mark your box or your boards out, you're doing your layout, you're going to go in, when you mark it, it's all usually a very good idea to put a mark on there. If you can see that arrow. That arrow is showing me when I am drawing out doing my layout that my cut should be on the arrow side of the line. When you're going through and you're doing your layout, you make your board, your lines, you do all your layout. I pick my board up, I move it over here, I put it over there, I move it around, I come back. Now I don't know which side of my line I'm supposed to be cutting on. By putting those arrows on there, I know that I cut on that side of the line, I'm good to go. And I'm not going to be cutting in and finding that this board is 16 inches and this board is 15 and 7/8 inches, and now they all line up wonky. So marking is a really good way. Another thing to keep in mind, when you are using your tape measure, a lot of times people will mark it, and when you go in there, people will just do just a tick. Instead of doing a tick, if you put your, I really should have done a better layout for this one. If you put your pencil at your mark and draw a line away from it, and then you move the pencil or your tape measure away, now you've got this line on there. Which end of that line is actually the end that marks where you want to cut? If instead of doing a single line, you put line there and then do a second one so that you make a V, that V is now pointing at exactly where you want to have your line to mark where you're cutting. Labeling is also a good thing. Use a pencil, label which piece is going where. If you have a particular piece of wood that you like a look of it, that wants to be my top or that wants to be my face. And also to mark your waste sections. Using a pencil, put a series of X's through it so you know that this is going to be the garbage, this is the scrap, I can cut into that, I don't have to care about it. Makes it really a lot simpler and a lot easier to work with what you're doing without kind of getting lost and getting to a point. If you've never heard the expression measure once, cut, or measure twice, cut once, it's hard to stretch a board when you've cut it too short, or if you've cut the wrong angle in it, or you're going through and you're going, yeah, that was supposed to be one piece, I mismarked it. So check your measurements, double check your measurements, and make sure that you've got that as much accuracy as you can give yourself. So from this board, again, 8-foot board, cut it down to 16-inch sections. I went ahead and did a little bit of pre-work. So what I end up with is right there, a stack of boards. So there are now 6 boards here. I've cut some of these previously and gone down to it. All 6 of the boards, out of that, 5 of them are going to be identical. Your top, your sides, everything is going to be identical. When you cut it out, your bottom is going to be smaller because it's going to go into the inside of the box. As my example here, the top is even in width to the box. The bottom, however, it's hard to see. You can see on this side pretty well. The bottom is set up inside the thickness of the box. So we're going to be taking double the thickness of the material off of that piece. But we'll get to that one later. So I've taken my 5 boards that I'm going to use for the construction of my box. My base I'm setting aside. That's going to get different treatment. Out of those 5 boards, 3 of them, the 2 sides and the top, are not going to be touched. The front, the back, and the top are going to be square. So in this case, I've come through, I've said, this one's got some knot holes in it. It's not particularly pretty. That'll be my back. That one's got a knot hole in it. It's okay. That'll be my front. There's not really a whole lot to it, so I'm going to go ahead and that'll be my top. One of the things that you need to be careful of when you're buying lumber is you need to watch out for for cup, for twist, and for any kind of bending. So when you get your lumber, go to your yard. First thing to do is you're going to check out the board, take a look at it, make sure there are no cracks, there are no chunks taken out of it, there's no waviness as much as you can. So usually to do that, when I do, I'm going to go in, I'm going to grab my board, and I'm going to pull it out from the rack, and I'm going to look straight down the length of the board. So what I can see in this particular board here is it's got a bit of a wave to it. So as I'm going, it's not completely straight. You can't just look at it flat. The weight of the boards, sometimes they're not, if the one underneath it is a little bit bent, then it might fit in there and they look straight and they look flat. So I'll pick it up, I'll look down the length of it, and I'll go, okay, so this board's got a bit of a bow in the middle of it. So it's not completely flat. Looking down the face of it, I'm looking to see if it has twist. And when I would say twist, what I'm looking for is if I look at the front of the board, I want the front of the board and the back of the board to be flat and planed. I don't want it to do something like that. It makes it really difficult to work with. The pieces are going to be, they're hard to get them to lay flat against each other. You're going to end up with gaps, and they're more difficult because the wood is trying to move differently. One thing to keep in mind is wood never stops moving. It is always in a state of reaction to the environment around it. It'll absorb moisture from the air. It expands and contracts depending on temperature. Usually when you get a board, and I really got to do something about the lighting. So the grain of the board this way, as you can see, there are lines running vertically. When the board is affected by the atmosphere around it, it's going to move perpendicular to those lines usually. The best way to think about it is it's basically like a collection of straws, and these are the straws all running lengthwise here. So as they absorb moisture in them, they don't get longer, they get wider. So your direction of movement is going to be this way. So anytime you build something, you want to kind of try and think about that to minimize the chance of the movement affecting thing. If I go in and I take this board where the lines are going this way, and I try and glue it to a board that the lines are going this way, it's going to be a very inherently weak joint, in part because this board is going this way and this one is going that way. So that glue joint is going to be under a lot of stress and take a great chance of breaking. This particular board is not flat. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can see that, but it rocks here. Doesn't mean it's unusable. There's a couple of different things you can do. Simplest thing I can do is I'm going to ignore it. I am going to make it so that my bow is towards the outside as opposed to the inside. The pieces on the ends that are closest to the wood are going to be more stable. If I was to glue it like this so that the bow was on the inside, as it moves a bit, it's going to have a tendency to pop loose at the top or the bottom. Whereas if the top or the bottom and the bottom are secured, that middle is going to have a greater chance of being stable. The other reason I wouldn't do this particularly if I wasn't using glue, you've got two kind of fasteners, a mechanical fastener and a chemical fastener. A mechanical fastener would be something like a screw or a nail or a peg or joinery, whereas a chemical fastener usually refers to glue or something of that lines, any form of a substance to hold them together. Glue, you can try sap. I've heard of people trying different types of glue. I don't get into um, organic stuff. I don't use hide glues or fish glues, any of those. I stick with modern chemical. Type Bond 3 is one that I really recommend. It's a good sturdy for use in the interior and exterior. And since a lot of our stuff gets traveled a lot, it goes from in the house, it goes to the trailer, it takes 6, 8, 10, 12-hour car rides places to a completely different environment. We abuse our furniture a lot more than our ancestors would have. So benefiting from modern chemistry is a pretty strong factor in my book. Let's see. I know I'm jumping all over the place here, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, we'll get covered everything. So I've found my board. I've brought my board. I brought it home. It's relatively flat. It's usable in the cup that I can do. I've determined on the type of saw I'm going to use. I'm laid out. I figured out how long it's going to go. There's a couple of different things to think about. And as you're building your toolkit, a tape measure, just a standard, retractable tape measure is a wonderful tool. It is easily found. It's readily, readily replaced if you need to. You can get it just about anywhere. A couple of interesting little bits are that little tip on the end is not always in place. So when you grab a tape measure, a lot of times if you pull on it when you get it, that thing's a bit loose. Those rivets in there are a bit loose, which won't affect things if you're doing framing construction. That, 16th of an inch or 32nd of an inch won't really matter a whole lot. But when you get down to something that is only a few inches long, that can actually affect things. So one of the things to do when you get that tape measure is actually to go and mark it on a board. Lay out the tape measure, mark off an inch or a foot, and then move it down and mark and put, say, if you marked 1 foot, put the 2 foot, the 24-inch mark on that mark that you made, and check to see where the end of your board is in relation to the tape measure. If you find that you are directly on the 12-inch mark, then your tape measure is pretty solid. You're good to go. If not, you might need to adjust that a little bit, find out where the end of that tape is, and then pin it flat with a couple of taps from your hammer to lock that tip in place so it's not going anywhere. Um, the other thing to look into is you can't always get a tape measure everywhere. And this is good to give you the inside, to give you the measurement, you know where that is. But if you're trying to measure the inside of something, now you've got the thickness of that tip there. That is going to throw your measurement off. And also a lot of times you're now inside, you got to bend it, you've got that bend there, it doesn't work well. So smaller measurements are nice. Also, you don't want to carry the big thing around. So there's a bunch of variety of different kinds of measuring tools you can use. So I happen to like them a lot. Combination square, you can pull the tape completely off it. You can get them in a couple of different lengths. This one is a 12-inch, different markings. You have 16th of an inch, you have 1/8 of an inch. Some of them are, you can get them in metric, but they're nice for a couple of different things. Some of the other specialty measuring tools you can look into that also come in really handy, it's called a speed square. They're used a lot for framing. They are really handy for that 90-degree angle. And if you are making cuts like these, being able to go in, mark down your length, drop your speed square on there, and know that I am 90 degrees from the cut, mark it off, and you're good to go. So they're not bad. You can get them in metal, you can get them in plastic. You can get them in different sizes depending on what you're doing. So having a couple of different measuring tapes, sticks, or rulers around is definitely beneficial. But don't worry about going crazy for it. There are always ways around it. If you don't have a speed square and to make your line, measure a couple of different spots. You can come in at the top, you can measure your 16 inches over. You start at the bottom, measure 16 inches over, draw a line. You've now got a line that you can cut on. Um, if What have I talked about that? So you've got your lumber. You've decided what kind of a tool you're using to cut with. While you're at the store, you might want to think about your finish and construction. If you're going to use glue, if you're going to use dowels, if you're going to put hinges or any kind of a latch or anything on it like that, then it's the time to think about it instead of having to make a second trip. That's a whole nother thing for a lot of that. There are a ton of different finishes out there depending on what your aim is for. If you're going for a historical look and you want to paint it, if you're just looking for protection, polyurethane is a good sturdy product. It'll provide probably the strongest protection among commercially available stuff right now. Linseed oil is a very forgiving finish, not quite as sturdy, but it's easy to put it on and it's easy to renew as time goes by. So it's a really nice one to go with. So In this case, what I am going to build ultimately with this box, I am going to end up with a 6-board box. I am going to have a
Somebody asked, what about spar urethane for finish?
So Spar urethane is great stuff. I tend to use it quite often. It's designed for exterior use, so a lot of them will have UV inhibitors in it as well, so your wood doesn't change its color as much. And it also, if you happen to put it over paint or anything like that, it'll help protect that finish a little bit. If I'm just doing something for indoors, or that I'm not going to see a lot of use, like boxes for hygiene things like that, I'll use linseed oil. But if I know it's going to be outside, chairs, boxes, tables, I tend to use spar urethane, or I've also heard it called marine urethane, depending on where you're at. So it's an option. Again, different class, but whatever you happen to be happy with. So as I was saying, so I'm going to cut my pieces. When I assemble them, I am going to both glue and peg them, which means I need to figure out ahead of time what size pegs I'm going to use. Historically, you would use a totally different system. I'm not even going to try and get into that one. I've got stuff on my blog, but a regular old dowel. And when you go to most hardware stores, you'll find they sell either whitewood or common dowels, and then they sell hardwood dowels. In this particular case, this is a red oak dowel. It's a 1/4 inch dowel, comes in a 36-inch long segment, which should be more than enough for this box. If you are putting a dowel in something, much like with nails and screws, you want to have at least double the thickness of the material you're going through. So as these are 1/4 inch or 3/4 inch boards, I need about 1.5 inches long dowel to peg them together, just to make sure you've got enough on both sides to keep it all together. So I'll go ahead, pick up my board, I picked up my dowels, I thought about my finish a little bit. I'm not going to worry about hinges on this one. That's just not a concern I need to make. So I'm pretty much good to go. Once you get back home and you get back to the shop, you starting your layout. Set your board down, you figure out dimensions, talked a little bit about that. Couple of different ways you can mark your layout depending on what you have and what you're comfortable with. Pencil is pretty common. If you do, you want to constantly be sharpening it a lot. Make sure you've got a nice sharp point. That thickness of the pencil actually, believe it or not, over time can add up a little bit, little bit, little bit. Plus, the fatter the line of the pencil, it kind of makes it more difficult to determine exactly where you're cutting. Are you cutting through the middle of the line? Are you cutting to one side or the other? The other thing you can do is you can actually get, they call it a marking knife, and it's basically just a sharp blade intended to mark along instead of a pencil. It does have some benefits over a pencil. You're not putting graphite down on the wood. You are also pre-scoring the wood, which will minimize tear out sometimes. It's also really useful if you're going to be using a hand saw. One of the things you can do with your marking knife is you can use a nice steel edge to score the top of the wood a few times to cut through those fibers so they're not going to tear out. And then if you come back through and you go in at a bit of an angle, you can actually create a shallow bed for where your saw can ride in. So it'll give you a little bit more control over it. And there are tons of videos out on YouTube and other places you can find on proper techniques for hand cutting with hand saws. So I would say, start looking around for those. I'm not going to really go into that there. It's an entirely different topic. But so I've got my board. I've laid out my board. I've marked my board. I've figured out my waist. I've marked which side of my board to cut on. In my case, I had the benefit of having a table saw and pre-prep for this class. So I went ahead and I cut my boards as I showed you earlier. The next step is going to be to take your board and you're going to figure out your thickness and your height. And then on your end pieces, you're going to want to mark that. So the easiest way to do that is to take your sideboard and put it on your end board and use your fingers. Your fingers generally don't lie to you. If you put it so that they are lining up and then feel as you're going, you should be able to feel if the two boards are lined up. If you feel a lip, move it around a little bit until you'll probably be able to determine where the two join, but you'll know if they're together or not, if it's a smooth, or if you're right on the edge, or if you're in or out a little bit to give you an idea where to cut. And then you take your nice sharp pencil, you run it along the inside to mark. You want to make sure that you're coming down so that the top of the board is flush with with the top of the sideboard is flush with the top of the end board. And you'll mark it so you'll have an L shape where that board will be cut out. Just like here. So this is the height and thickness of this sideboard is notched into the end board, and that is where it'll sit on and also attach. This is the most complicated piece of this project right here, and it's not, so if you can get this down, you're golden. You're good to go. So you mark that out, obviously, on both sides, one for each board and on both of your end pieces. Once you've got those marked out, your next step is to cut them, and you'll probably end up with something that looks a bit like this if you're using any kind of a circular cutting blade, table saw or a circular saw. If you're using a jigsaw or hand saw or a bandsaw, you'll cut them completely off and you'll just have this nice finished piece. It just looks like that and you're ready to go. The one thing to keep in mind is a circular blade is going to make a curved cut. It doesn't come off completely even. If you'll notice really closely here, this one is almost all the way through, but this one is not. That's the difference of the thickness of the blade. You can, a couple of different things you can do with that. You can either grab a handsaw and then saw down, or on something like pine, it's really soft, you can just kind of push it and the whole thing will fall off. If you have to put too much force into it, then you probably are going to want to back off and use a saw. The grain is really tight. You might be using something that was sturdier, like an oak or something like that, that just is going to splinter badly. And then you're going to need a blade. In this case, I've got a 1-inch chisel here. You can use a razor blade or preferably in a holder of some sort. And you're going to come in because what is left, if I can get that to see, let's see. You can see there's that little bit right there. That's what's left over from that cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to take my chisel and I am just going to very gently plane off thin strips as I go. Just take little bits. Since you've already cut this bottom portion here, it gives you a stop. You know how far to go. And I'm just going to keep going down until I've got it flush and parallel. The nice thing with a chisel is I can actually put the chisel flat so it's riding on that wood, and it will tell me when I'm getting to that point where it is flat. And as you can see, so now it's nice and smooth. It's in plane with this one here. It's not a big deal. It's a quick, easy thing to do. And a little bit of practice, you just knock it out, no big deal. But you're now ready to go with your next step. So we've now got the two ends of the box that are cut and ready to go. As I've said before, this board, if you can see it, is a little bit bent. So I'm going to make sure that that warpage is to the inside. So when I look at my boards, there's actually a gap in there. If you really wanted, there are various things you can do to try and get it completely flat. But for this particular project, I'm really not going to worry about it. As long as it holds together and is sturdy, I'm not particularly worried if it's perfectly square and straight. So from here, I'm now taking the rest of my boards. And if you cut this right, it will all go together, making sure that you got your curves in the right direction. And this is what's known as a dry fit. I'm looking at it to make sure that everything is going together right. I want to make sure that I don't have anything like in this particular case, I need to go back through and I need to check this out. It's hard to see in here, but my sideboard is actually a little taller than my backboard. So I need to actually, I'm going to have to take a little out of here and play with it. But it is what it is. It's something that I'm not going to worry about exactly at this moment. But this is where you're going through and you are looking to see if there are any flaws or there are any things that is going to be a hindrance to assembling this board. You really don't want to have a issue pop up when you're in the middle of dealing with glue. At that point, it's pretty much too late. Another thing you're going to need for this particular project is some way to hold this thing together. One of the other axioms of woodworking is you can never have too many clamps. In this case, these are Bessie clamps. I got them at Home Depot. This is it's about a 14-inch clamp, so it's got plenty of throw for this project. For 20 bucks, you can buy a pack that has two 14 inches and then two of these smaller ones here, which I believe are 6 inches, which is a great beginning set to start with. You can do a lot with these smaller clamps, and it's a good way to start. So what I would then end up doing is I will come through and I am going to start clamping as I go. I put just a little bit of pressure on there to keep it together, but not really make it tight. And then I'm going to line everything up and make sure that it's finger smooth. I can look at that and I can say, okay, this fits nicely. That's going to work. Can I work with this? Or what do I need to change before I'm good to go? Um, the more bends, cups, bows, anything like that that is in the project, the more difficult this is at this stage. Hence why being careful and selective when you're picking out your wood. There is a certain modern tendency. We are polite people, especially within the society. We don't want to make a mess. We don't want to make a bother. Most places that you go that you are going to find lumber, as long as you are conscientious of what you're doing, don't make a huge mess in the process and clean up after yourself, they really don't mind if you go in and you kind of pick through the lumber and find what is going to work best for you. So by all means, be picky. Don't just grab the first few off the top and hope it works. Take a few minutes, go through, kind of look at everything, decide which boards are going to work for you. Maybe this board is a little warped. Maybe that board's a little prettier and you want that grain in your finished project. But take the time, be a little bit selective. It's your money, it's your project. You're going to be looking at this for potentially the next 10, 15 years. You want to be as happy with it as possible. So here I put 4 clamps on. In this case with these bow, I will actually add a couple more when I get around to gluing it. So you don't need to put these clamps on and crank them down. You don't need to be absolutely just destroying the wood. And it's actually detrimental in some cases to put too much pressure on those clamps. You can damage the fibers. You can, if you'll notice, these have these little red caps on them there. It's a plastic. It gives them a bit more grip, but it also gives it a bit of a cushion. So you're not damaging the face of the wood too much when you clamp it down. Usually I'll get it in there tight and then I'll give it a few twists more to make sure it's nice and sturdy. But you don't need a whole lot. All the clamps are really doing is once you put glue on there, they're keeping things immobilized until the glue can read the bottle. You'll find some of them that will have anywhere from they call it an open time, and that is the amount of time it takes for the glue to actually set up the chemical bond, where it's still really easy to move around. It's not attached to anything really solidly. So that's time you have to put your glue on, get everything in position, and clamp it. Some of them, like I said, 15, 20, some of them are really long. If you've ever seen epoxies listed as like a 5-minute epoxy or a 15-minute epoxy or a 30-minute epoxy, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the open time before it goes from a malleable, usable product to the chemical reaction is starting to occur and is now forming the bond that you want. And you can sometimes move things around in that period when that started and that chemical process has started, but doing so will ultimately weaken the bond a bit because you started that bonding process and now you've broken it. So now it's got to kind of start again and it's not as strong as it could have been. So in this case, I've got my uh, box started. I've got everything clamped in place. I'm good to go. The lid is really simple. It's not going anywhere. It is just the top. You're not doing anything to it. And if you did all your dimensions right and you cut it right, it should sit perfectly square on the top or pretty close to it. Um, Oops, sorry, reading the bottom of the screen there.
You're fine. I'll ask you questions when.
So you can see this is from an 8-foot board. It's not a humongous box, um, if, but it's a good multi-use size. It's a small guard box for events. It is a dish box, whatever you're going to do with it. Your top is not going to be difficult. The other really nice thing is you've got these pieces left over from when you were cutting your sides. They make really good battens. You cut it down a little bit so it fits inside. You affix them to the bottom of your lid, and then when you put it in there, it doesn't move around. Much like that right there. So when I am totally done with this box, what I will have left over from it for scrap out of an 8-foot board is I will have these pieces right here that I'm not using for anything. They can go in the fire or whatever. The next step, once you've got these assembled and you've glued it up, you're good to go, you're going to want to let it dry at least a couple of hours at this point to make sure that glue bond is set up really well. Once you've got it glued and clamped, if you're going to dowel it, by all means, this is a good time to do it. You're perfectly fine to do so. And that is simply a matter of grabbing a drill with the appropriate size drill bit and drilling in there. There's a couple of different things you can do to make sure you've got the right depth for that. One quick and simple one is to measure the length of your drill bit and put some tape on it so you can mark out how far you want to go. You don't want to drill 2 inches in. If you're only going to put a 1.5 inch dowel in there, then it just affects the finish. It's a visual thing, and it's all the way. You've got that voided air pocket inside there. And you're also wasting your time. Why drill the hole that deep if you don't need to? So by putting it in there, and sometimes it even helps if you leave that dowel sticking out just a little bit proud. And in woodworking, if you hear the term proud, it means it sticks out a little bit. So if you've got the top of your board and you're here like that and you got a dowel going through it, instead of being perfectly flush with the top, a little bit proud is just going to stick out just a hair. Not a lot. And then go through and clean that up afterwards. You can clean it up with a file, you can clean it up with sandpaper, you can pare it down with a chisel or a block plane, whatever you happen to have on hand that you're comfortable with doing, just to kind of take it down so it's flush with the face of the outside of the box. One thing you do need to be careful with when you're using dowels is finishing. So if you are sanding the whole thing when you're done to get a nice even finish and erase any pencil lines or nicks or gouges, blending things in, your dowel is going to be on end grain. And by end grain, what we're talking about is when I mentioned earlier that you can think of your wood as a collection of straws. Well, the dowels usually are running the same way. So the end grain is the end of those straws. It is more difficult to flatten. It reacts a little bit differently. When you're sanding the face grain, it'll come down fairly smooth, but this end grain can stick out a little bit prouder. So you just got to take a little bit more attention to the detail there to make sure that you're not ending up with your dowel sticking out higher or ending up with your surface kind of doing a dip because your dowel keeps it nice and high and you put more pressure near it and it goes out there. So just light, gentle strokes as you go. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, Once I'm done there, my next step is I'm going to turn my attention to the bottom piece. So this one I've already trimmed down somewhat, not a lot. There's still probably going to need to be some fine tuning. One of the things to be careful of is a lot of people will look at it and they'll go, okay, I'm going to stick it in there, and they'll start fitting it from the top. The problem is you're not guaranteed to be perfectly square. In a perfect world, your box is going to be square, it's going to be plumb. The top dimension is exactly the same as the bottom dimension. Especially when you're starting, it's not always the case. And especially when you've been doing it for a long time, it's still not always the case. So what I will generally do is I will take my box and I will come in from the bottom as best I can. In this case, it's still a little bit wide. It won't go in there completely. So I'm going to need to trim that down a bit. In my case, I can run it through the saw, or you can sand it down if you need be, or you can plane it down if you happen to have a hand plane. I personally am a big fan of the hand plane. You take a little bit off as you go, but it's just a matter of getting that to fit in there snugly without being tight. If you have to force it in there, you're putting a lot of pressure on your joints and risking blowing out the box. So if it is in there and it is going, like you can see here, I've actually got a little bit of a gap in there, but now it's getting tight over here. The board moved differently. But if I come over here, it actually is moving in a lot smoother. Whether that is the board itself is being warped so it doesn't want to go in. It could be that my cuts are off a little bit, so I've got a 90-degree angle here, an 89-degree angle here, and a 91-degree angle here, so it doesn't quite go the same. This is that fiddly bit, and that's the point where you got to have the patience and realize that just because it doesn't go in perfectly when you cut it doesn't mean that you've ruined the project, that you got to start all over, you got to go buy more wood. If it's super small, if you can get, you can stick it in there and, you know, oh, well, I got a ton of room there. I screwed something up horribly. Sometimes you measured wrong. Sometimes you might have the piece turned wrong. Sometimes if you go in here and it won't go in this way, if you turn it this way, it goes in just fine because the angles are weird. Play with it a little bit. Really, it's the best I can tell you. I know it's not super scientific or accurate, but playing with it a little bit, take your time. And for things like this, I really, really recommend going by hand. Don't go back to the big mechanical saws. Don't go back to the just lopping off job lots. Take your time and kind of sneak it in there so that you're fitting the piece so it fits nicely. It's always easier to take a little bit more off, but it's really hard to put some back on. So for this one, like I said, my height is good. My width is off a little bit. So to fit this in, I'm going to grab a hand plane. I'm going to take a few shavings off of this, and I am going to make it fit that way. Now, if really can't get you the detail here, in this case, I am probably 1/8 of an inch off. So that's going to take a couple of strokes with the hand plane, but not a lot to get it to fit in there nicely. Once I've got it in there fitting nicely, again, I'm going to glue it and I'm going to dowel it. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue along the edges all the way around. I'm going to put it in there. Generally, I'll have it sitting down somewhere so it slides in. And then I'm going to dowel it as well because I want that extra stability for the bottom. Especially if I've already doweled the sides, I might as well dowel the bottom so it's got a uniform look to it.
Someone asked, what if you don't have a hand plane?
Sand it. You can saw it, but the problem is anytime that you are trying to saw on the very edge, especially if it's not something you do a whole lot, you risk your saw going offline or slipping down. It's hard because you're not biting down the middle of it where you've got the sides of the wood to support both sides. You've got just a gap so it falls off. So as you're coming through with your, I'm graceful, can you tell? So as I'm coming through, instead of being nicely supported on all sides, my saw can't go anywhere, it falls off. Or it can wiggle one way or wiggle the other and you get a weird thing. So
Someone else suggested a rasp.
you can use a rasp. Generally, in my definition, a rasp or a file are pretty close. The difference being a rasp has much more aggressive teeth. It'll take a lot of material off and it leaves a much rougher finish. You can get a variety of files all over the place. I've got several of them. I use them. I kind of prefer a file over sandpaper. It's you've got a flat board. It's already backed. Sandpaper is flexible, so you have a tendency with sandpaper, even if you attach it to a block, to round things over. So instead of keeping that nice 90-degree turn, you now have got a bow, because as you're going over it there. With a file, it's a solid flat piece. So if you set it down there, and as long as you keep yourself in the same plane, you don't want to go like this. Because as you're going like this, your angles of your hands start to change. If you keep it relative to your body and move your whole body, it's a real simple, cheap trick to make your to keep yourself in that same plane so that as you're filing it down, you keep it relatively flat and going. I like hand planes. I happen to have them, but again, I'm not trying to get you to go out and buy every tool under the sun. So a file is another multi-purpose. They're generally inexpensive, and that will kind of help you get your final dimensions there. Sneak up on it until you get to the right point. Hopefully that answers that one. So, just a moment. So here's a hand plane. It is just a small scrub plane. I am going to go through, and all I'm doing is I'm taking some off as I go. I'm not going to do the whole thing. It'd take a bit, and I don't have a clamp set up for it. But again, I'm going to plane that down until it fits in the bottom, and then I'm going to glue and clamp it so I'm good to go. And then from there, my next step would be to make sure that my top fits smoothly. We talked about you make a couple of battens so it fits in there.
I
And
I actually had a quick question myself.
okay,
Do you have any suggestions? Because I know I've done things with, drills and that kind of thing before, and I'm not great at keeping the drill straight. Do you have any suggestions for helping people keep that drill straight so they don't drill into their box while they're doing
yeah.
the pegging?
So first off, measure. Start out and measure exactly where you want. Don't just eyeball it and go, yeah, I think that's good. You'll get to there eventually, but if you're not sure, grab a ruler, mark out exactly where you want to go. Sometimes you can get drills. They have fancy little bubbles in the bottom, so you know you're directly square or not. The other thing is you can go, and again, that speed square that I mentioned before, you can go in there and you can kind of situate it so you know where you're going. And you're looking for that gap right here to make sure that it's pretty on. And obviously you're going to know if you're well over here or not, but it's really hard unless your drill bit is exactly the size there to fit. The other thing you can do is, I love this little guy. It's a very handy little thing, and it's just, they sell them as Machinist Squares, and it is nothing more than a steel 90-degree angle. So I can come in here and I can situate it, and I can actually measure and say, yeah, my drill bit is 90 degrees, and then come over to the side and say, yeah, it's still 90 degrees. Because it's very easy to, if you're looking at it this way, to say, yeah, I'm 90 degree on this side, but I'm actually at an angle over here. In this particular case, a little bit of angle might not be a bad idea if you put your drill bits in or your dowels in so that when you look at the end of it, they're pointing in from the top and the bottom. That'll help kind of lock the whole thing together so that the dowels, the sides, if the glue connection breaks, the dowels are locked in there. It can't go up because of this dowel. It can't go down because of this dowel. It kind of helps keep it in place. And it also gives you this kind of neat oval from the dowel when you cut it on that end, if that makes any sense.
Also, how many dowels would you put into a side or to the bottom on the sides?
Generally, with a 1/4 inch dowel, I would not go any closer than an inch apart, just because you want to have plenty of wood around it to kind of lock that in and give it strength. But other than that, you can go as many as you really want to go. For this size at that nominal 12-inch, I would use either 3 or 4, depending on what I was feeling like and how lazy I was. I'd probably go down about 3/4 of an inch so that you've got a solid 1/2 inch of wood above where your dowel is on the side, because you don't want it right at the top or right at the bottom. So about 3/4 of an inch, so that it's, that thickness. This is again a 1/4 inch dowel. So from your center point, it's going to have an 1/8 inch on either side to, for displacement of the dowel, or for the size of the hole, and put them in that way. Again, make sure you put glue in the dowel holes as well. It's not something a lot of people think about, and your dowels can work out sometimes, but not a lot. A couple of drops, and as you're rotating your dowel, or you're putting your dowel in, if you rotate it a little bit to make sure the glue kind of coats everything and goes in evenly all around. The problem is if you put too much glue in that hole, if you've got a good tight fit with your dowel, as you go down, you're now pushing the glue ahead of it and making a pocket of glue that is now impeding your dowel's ability to get in that hole, and it's got to go somewhere. Sometimes it will actually go through the fibers in the dowel, and as you're pounding the dowel in, you will find that glue is starting to come out of the end of the dowel. Sometimes it will blow out the side of the wood. It goes unpredictable places, so you don't really want to go too crazy with it. Just a bit.
Do you sorry, I have one more dowel question. Do you what do you use to put the dowel in? I mean, I'm assuming you can't just use your hand. Do you use a hammer? Do you use a mallet, like a rubber mallet?
I don't like rubber mallets. They bend really weird. I like a solid mallet. I generally like wood. I tend to not use metal on wood if I can avoid it, because the metal is not going to get damaged. Your project is. So in this particular case, I've just got a big wood mallet. It's taken a lot of abuse over the years, and I will go in there. However, the other thing is I'm lazy and I will often grab whatever's close to hand. And for something small like that, and I know I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are going to be, condemning me to tool user hell for this one, but I will grab my chisel. It is a metal face, so it's reinforced, but it's light. And for a small dowel like that, as I'm tapping it in, I don't want to give it a big hard smash and have it go in there, especially if I've got air and or glue trapped in there. I want it to get in there and kind of work its way in and acclimate to each other. So I'll just tap my dowel in there, and if it hits a point where I think it should be going further, but it's not, then I'll grab the mallet and start tapping. I also am guilty of, I don't cut my dowels to length a lot of times. I will start with a long length of dowel like this, and I'll just kind of tap as I go until it starts getting in there, and then I'll cut it off a little closer to it and tap it the rest of the way. Um, I don't really recommend doing it, but I I do. So I can't really talk too much about that one there. One other important consideration is dowels are also nominal in size. So there are a variety of tools that you can get for measuring the size of your dowel. And a lot of places, if you go, you can buy, they will have a sheet, usually plastic or steel, that is nothing but a bunch of graduated sizes for your different holes. Just they've just drilled holes all the way through it and then marked it. So you can take your dowel and you can go in there and you can go, oh, this 1/4 inch dowel is actually a little bit thicker than that. So it's going to be a real tight fit in my 1/4 inch hole, or it's actually a little bit looser. Maybe I should go down to the next size drill bit and try so it's nice and snug in there. I am also a big fan of multitasking with my tools. So I have been known to take and cut dowels to relatively close. And if they're too big to fit nicely in that hole, I will chuck them into my drill in place of the bit. I will literally pop my drill bit out, stick my dowel in there, and then I'll grab a sanding disc and I will just sand the dowel with the drill going on it to get it down to a fit that is nice and snug without being tight. You can usually tell if you start putting your dowel in there, if you start hammering it in there and it's just really tight, or you pull it out, if the end is compressed and shiny, it's too tight. You're going to probably split something. Um, Give it a little bit of a light sand just to make sure it fits in there nicely. Sometimes you get dowels also that are a little bit rough or it's raised a little bit. So just a couple of seconds, hit it with some sandpaper, make it smooth. And instead of having a square end on the end, take your sandpaper and just run the dowel on there a bit to kind of round out the tip a little bit so that it goes in that hole a little bit nicer and makes it a little bit less of a pain in the butt to get it in place.
Somebody just asked, where did you get a wooden mallet? They've been looking, they haven't been able to find them at their local Lowe's or Home Depot.
You're not usually. They're more of a specialty thing. In this particular case, I made it. This is my Laurel Mallet. All jokes intended there. But I had a friend of mine who gave me a bunch of chunks of laurel from his yard when he chopped down a big bush, and there were some good sized pieces. It was more of a small tree, and it's an incredibly dense, heavy mallet. And it is literally, I carved a block. I took an angle off there so that when I hammer, it's a nice flat surface at that angle as opposed to a 90 degree. You can kind of see that it tapers in a little bit, not like your traditional like maul or your Thor's hammer that everyone's pretty much familiar with in this group, I think. Um, it's hard to find them. You can find them at places. Woodcraft is online and they sell them. Rockler is another one that sells them. Any of the stores that are specifically devoted to specialty woodworking and they're not like a home improvement store, you'll probably find it. I am an advocate of old tools. I am an advocate of making your own tools whenever you can. So this one is one that I made, and you can actually see there's that really nice notch from where I was cutting, and this was the piece I had left over, and I said, well, I'll see if it works. And this particular mallet is going on, I think, 6 years at this point, and that piece has never split out. I've refaced it a couple of times because I beat the heck out of it, and it's a tool and I've used it. But I would suggest there. The other thing is, if you know other woodworkers, ask them. They might have local suppliers for it, or if you are near to a local woodworker, obviously not at this particular time, but a lot of us are much like any other crafter in the SCA. We love to talk about what we're doing. We love to show off what we've got, and we love to share that knowledge. So I personally have a habit of I'll have people over to my shop, to work on projects. We've had bench days, cooler days, chair days, just look around because there's a lot of people that are out there and who are more than happy to share their knowledge. And you might not have that particular tool, but they might, or they might have a workaround for it. So
We can also put together some links for once the video is posted and recorded. We can put some links on the page for it, so that way people have access to that too.
also a good point. So let's see. So we talked about getting the clamps. One other option. One of the things with woodworking is there is an awful lot of workarounds. There are things that you might not be able to find the things as the previous question, finding a wooden mallet somewhere. Where do I go for that? So you can find wooden mallets. You can find workarounds for it. I might not be able to find a wooden mallet. However, there's a Tandy Leather near me, and I know that they sell rawhide and plastic mallets. I can go there. I can go to Home Depot or Harbor Freight and I can buy a rubber mallet or a dead blow mallet. Plastic dead blow mallet, if you're not familiar, it's usually a metal or more often plastic mallet that has got lead weights inside it, so that as you're moving, the transferal of motion goes and it creates a heavier impact than it would just by strength of your arm alone. So you can grab something like that, and it's metal or it's a hard plastic. You don't want it to mar your wood. You can glue some light leather on the tip of it so that you're not dangling up your wood as you go, and just replace the leather as need be. For clamps, there are tons of plans out there. You can make your own clamps as need be. Some people have had luck with using ratchet straps to keep things secured down there. They're not quite as well. And if you do use ratchet straps for a project like this, one of the things that you'll run into is a term called a call. And basically what you're doing is to focus the power of the straps where you need it. You're going to want to use something that will narrow it down. So you could take like these pieces of excess here and put them over, yeah, put them right over the edges where you see these clamps are kind of at. Put those there and then put the ratchet straps on there, and those will help to concentrate the force right on those edges where you want them. They do need to be thick enough that they're not going to flex easily. You want that to transfer as much of the force that those clamps are putting on there as possible. And even in a case like this, where, as I said, this is bowed, so if I had a couple of hardwood scraps on hand, or maybe even these, I may very well stick those down there and clamp them on there as well to put more pressure exactly where I want it, and to kind of even it out, so that instead of having to put a clamp every couple of inches to get a whole lot of force on here, I can put that call down on there, and that will spread the force out and put it in more places than one. So let's see. I think, yeah. So that is kind of my walkthrough on how to build this box. Hopefully it'll give everybody kind of an idea of where to start, and see that it's not a big scary project that, oh my god, I can't do that. Everything is a question of it's steps. It's learning the next step and pushing yourself a little bit more and building up to it. Don't feel that I can never do that. So and so has been doing it for 40 years and they've got all these tools and a great big shop. My very first project actually was a uh, tourney table from the, I want to say it was the 20 or 25-year version of the Known World Handbook, and it was cut out of a single sheet of plywood with a jigsaw. And I set that thing up over a couple of milk crates in my backyard and said a few impolite words at it when it wasn't going the way I wanted it to, and I made a table. A couple of years later, I made my first 6-board box with a couple of pieces of pine left over from some shipping crates that came in for when I was in the military. I had those. I had a circular saw and I had a hand drill. Um, you got to start somewhere and don't be afraid to just jump right in. You don't need the big name brand tools. I have some of them. I've got them over the years, but I started out using stuff you could get at Home Depot and garage sales. I started out with Ryobi and I started out with Black & Decker and things like that. And I've moved up a bit as years went by for different features that they had. So grow into the craft. Don't expect to jump right in and, throw a ton of money at it. So this particular project was envisioned as a starting point and as an idea of how to start with tools that you probably have on hand. Most everybody has a drill of some sort if you own a home or if you hang pictures in your apartment or whatever. So having the drill is nice for the dowels, but the big thing here is the saw. And learning how to use your saw, and it's a good project for that. Is mostly straight lines. There are various things you can do. If you've got a jigsaw, you can kind of round the base of this a little bit to make it individual feet so it's a little bit nicer. um, but it's a kind of a question of personal taste. As I said, this is intended as a series, so this is the first video there. The next video that we'll be putting together at some point is actually going to be a bench. In this particular case, this is a very common style of bench. You see them all over. This one is specifically a breakdown bench. It is a little bit more complicated than the box in terms of the fact that it's got these curved cuts, but you really don't need them. The biggest difference between the box and this bench is you're going to need chisels for this one, because there are what are called mortises in the top. And that will be the focus for our next video when that one comes out. So at this point, do we have any questions?
While we're waiting for questions, if anybody wants to type any in the thing, I had a question about the box. So you talked about the battens for the top of the lid. Um, if people want to use a hinge instead, is there a place that they can find stuff that is like relatively period looking, or any options that might work for that kind of thing?
Period hinges are really hard to find, partly because they are very specially. They usually have to be made individually by hand. I tend to use a lot of modern hinges and hide them as much as I can. There is a company called Van Dyke Restorers, and they have quite a few different styles of hinges in there that will work for some SCA periods. Honestly, your best bet for hinges, if you decide to go that route, is to really reach out to your other local crafters. Find your local blacksmiths and metal workers and see if they make them. I am also a very big fan of barter and of supporting fellow artisans. So see what they made. Maybe you can barter. Hey, I'll make 2 boxes. You make 2 sets of hinges. We both walk away with one. Um, or they can usually get you an idea on a good price. Or if they don't make them themselves, they can direct you to somebody who does. You can find places, things like Etsy. There's a lot of artisans, metal workers on there that you can find hinges available. So those would be my suggestions.
Somebody also suggested their favorite hinge for boxes is a 2-inch wide piece of leather down the length of the lid.
There's I have heard people do that with conjecturally that leather hinges are a period thing. I have not encountered a whole lot of them in the stuff that I have experienced, but it's certainly an option for you. And if that's the way you want to do it, go for it. Uh, it wouldn't survive in most cases. Most of these things, I mean, we're talking several hundred years old, up to even 1,000 years old, and leather just doesn't last that long.
Somebody asked, are wooden buttons and mushrooms considered appropriate for these projects to cover doweling?
I'm not sure why you would. To be honest with you, you're basically going to take and put a wooden dowel into the project, and then you're going to cut another wooden dowel to go on top of it. Um, it's Wooden doweling is not a particularly common feature to see. It's a much more common in our modern recreations than in historical ones. It does go. Usually, you see doweling more in furniture than in boxes, tables, benches, things like that. Um, if you wanted to, I suppose you could, but I'm kind of not seeing a reason why you would want to.
Yeah, somebody said buttons and mushrooms came about to cover metal screws in the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah,
Somebody mentioned the sound of the bonus to a leather lid in the aspect of the SCA use is the hinge is quiet and doesn't make noise in court.
fair enough, as long as you actually like open and close it gently as opposed to dropping it. But yeah, one of the other things is if your metal hinges are square to the wood, it'll also not squeak nearly as bad.
Somebody asked, what is the ideal length for the box? I have some 48-inch boards from an abandoned project.
What are you going to put inside it? Um, so when I make boxes, I figure on what am I going to put inside it and what's comfortable to carry. So if I made a box as big as this bench, so this bench right here is 33 3/4 inches long. If I've made a box this size and I've now got to carry it, that's really awkward for me to try and carry unless I'm going to put handles in it. And even if I put handles in it, it's still kind of a long width for me. I'd probably want to do two people, especially if it was a wide box and a heavy box. It really comes down to what your personal comfort is and your aesthetic and what look you're going for. This one is not that long. This one is 24 inches exactly. So your 48-inch boards would work perfectly for that. Um, it's what's your personal aesthetic, what works for your period. As I said, the long narrow look fits in particularly well for the Norse and Scandinavian style cultures. Usually the sides are tapered in a little bit though, instead of vertical like this. What fits in your car is another major feature in there. What do you transport with? If you're making a 48-inch long box, is it going to fit in your 38-inch wide back seat?
I would add that height is important to look at too, right? As far
It
as
is
like
also.
comfortable for sitting and stuff.
That is also another thing. If you are planning on using these boxes for multi-purpose, the one that I've been throwing around here, we tend to take with us, and it's good for storing things like s'mores supplies for around the fire at night and sitting on said thing. So planning your box height off of what you're going to use it for. 18 inches is a really nice generic height for a box to sit on. Okay, so it sounds like we pretty much.
Agree with the storage in the back of car. My boxes fit my Prius nicely. Also about chair height for the boxes. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Chair height for boxes.
All right. Well, it sounds like I guess we've got everybody, all the questions answered then. And I want to thank everybody for showing up. And at some point in the near future, if you watch the early Sweden page, I'm sure you'll see the video for this going up and also links for future classes, not only for myself, but for a lot of other people. The next one we'll see will be making the bench.